The morning sun of June 3, 1942 cast long shadows across the deck of the USS Enterprise as Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood in his command center at Pearl Harbor, studying the decoded Japanese messages that would change the course of the Pacific War. The intercepted communications revealed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's audacious plan to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle at Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand that had suddenly become the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific Ocean. Station HYPO, the Navy's cryptographic unit under Commander Joseph John Rockford, had been working around the clock to break the Japanese naval code JN-25. Their breakthrough came when they successfully identified AF as the Japanese designation for Midway. To confirm this intelligence, Nimitz authorized a clever deception. Midway was instructed to send an uncoded message, reporting problems with their water distillation plant. Within hours, Japanese intelligence intercepted and relayed that AF was short of water, confirming what the codebreakers already knew. Admiral Yamamoto's plan was masterful in its complexity and devastating in its intended consequences. The architect of Pearl Harbor sought to draw out the American carriers and destroy them in one crushing blow, eliminating American naval power in the Pacific for years to come. His strategy involved a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to split American forces, followed by the main assault on Midway. Once the atoll fell, Yamamoto believed the Americans would be forced to negotiate a peace treaty, securing Japanese dominance across the Pacific. The Japanese First Air Fleet, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, represented the most powerful carrier force ever assembled. For fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu carried over 150 of Japan's finest aircraft and most experienced pilots. These were the same carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and their crews were confident of another overwhelming victory. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive naval history, The Two-Ocean War, the Japanese force included 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers, supported by numerous submarines and auxiliary vessels. This armada represented nearly half of Japan's entire naval strength, a testament to the importance Yamamoto placed on this operation. But Nimitz possessed something invaluable: advanced knowledge of enemy intentions. Despite having only 3 operational carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, he positioned his forces to achieve tactical surprise. The wounded Yorktown, which should have required months of repairs after the Battle of the Coral Sea, was patched up in just 72 hours by Pearl Harbor's dedicated shipyard workers, who understood the stakes. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher would command Task Force 17 aboard Yorktown, while Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance led Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet. These men, along with their crews, carried the hopes of a nation still reeling from the disasters at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Philippines. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Japan's vision of Pacific dominance would become reality or whether American resolve would prevail against overwhelming odds. As the opposing fleets moved toward their fateful rendezvous, neither side fully comprehended that the next 4 days would witness the death of the age of the battleship and the birth of carrier warfare as the dominant force in naval combat. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, 1942 shrouded the Japanese First Air Fleet as it approached Midway from the northwest. Admiral Nagumo's carriers cutting through the calm Pacific waters with deadly purpose. At 0 for 30 hours, the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu erupted into controlled chaos as 108 aircraft prepared for the opening strike against Midway's defenses. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the first wave of Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3 Valdive bombers, escorted by Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Their mission was straightforward: neutralize Midway's airfields and defensive installations to prepare for the planned invasion. As the aircraft disappeared into the morning haze, Nagumo retained half his strike force aboard the carriers, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes specifically intended for attacking American Warships when they inevitably appeared. On Midway itself, Navy radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation at 0553 hours, approximately 93 miles out. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as every available American aircraft scrambled to meet the threat. 26 obsolete Brewster F-2 Buffalo fighters and 6 Grumman F-4F Wildcats rose to intercept the Japanese bombers, while the island's strike aircraft, including ancient Vought SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers and Martin B-26 Marauder medium bombers, launched to attack the Japanese carriers. The aerial battle over Midway demonstrated the harsh reality of combat between veteran Japanese pilots and inexperienced American aviators flying inferior aircraft. The Zeros tore through the American fighter screen with devastating efficiency, shooting down 15 of the 26 defenders while losing only 2 of their own. The Japanese bombers proceeded to pummel Midway's installations, destroying fuel tanks, hangars, and the mess hall while cratering the runways. However, Tomonaga's radio message to Nagumo at 0700 hours would prove fateful. There is need for a second attack. The airfield remained operational despite the bombing, and American aircraft continued to launch from the damaged but serviceable runways. This assessment forced Nagumo into a critical decision that would haunt him for the remainder of the battle. At 0715 hours, Nagumo ordered his reserve strike force to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second attack on Midway, abandoning the armor-piercing ordnance intended for American ships. As his crews began the laborious process of switching ordnance, a lookout aboard the cruiser Tone reported 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 10 degrees. Distanced 140 miles. The sighting report electrified the Japanese fleet. American warships were supposed to be hundreds of miles away, rushing from Pearl Harbor after news of the Midway attack reached them. Instead, they were already in position, threatening Nagumo's carriers from the northeast. At 0820 hours, a follow-up report confirmed Nagumo's worst fears: enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier. Nagumo faced an agonizing decision. His first strike was returning from Midway, low on fuel and requiring immediate recovery. His reserve aircraft were in the process of being rearmed for a second Midway attack. Meanwhile, American carriers lurked somewhere to the northeast, their own strike aircraft potentially already airborne and heading toward his fleet. The Admiral chose to recover his Midway strike force first, then launch a coordinated attack against the American carriers with both his returning aircraft and his reserves. It was a reasonable decision based on sound naval doctrine, but it meant precious time would pass with his flight decks cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance presenting perfect targets for American dive bombers. As Nagumo's carriers began recovering aircraft at 0830 hours, the American strike groups were already airborne and converging on the Japanese fleet. The trap that Nimitz had set was about to snap shut, but the outcome remained far from certain as both sides raced against time in a deadly game of aerial chess. At 0702 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron gathered his 15 Douglas TBD-1 Devastator torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard the USS Hornet. The weathered squadron leader, a part Sioux Indian from South Dakota, studied the plotting board showing the estimated position of the Japanese fleet. Intelligence suggested the enemy carriers lay approximately 155 miles to the southwest, but Waldron's instincts told him otherwise. The Devastator was already obsolete by 1942 standards, a slow, lumbering aircraft that required a straight, level approach to deliver its Mark 13 torpedo, with a top speed of barely 115 miles per hour when loaded. It was vulnerable to both fighter attack and anti-aircraft fire. Worse still, the Mark 13 torpedo itself was plagued with mechanical problems, often failing to explode even when it struck its target. As Squadron 8 departed the Hornet, Waldron made a fateful decision that would save American lives while costing his own. Instead of following the prescribed search pattern that would take his squadron southwest, he trusted his combat experience and led his men north-northwest. directly toward where his intuition told him the Japanese carriers would be. His decision separated Squadron 8 from their fighter escort and the accompanying dive bombers, leaving the torpedo planes to face the Japanese fleet alone. However, American damage control techniques proved superior to Japanese expectations. Under the direction of Lieutenant Commander Clarence Edgar Aldrich, Yorktown's repair parties worked with remarkable efficiency to restore their ship's fighting capability. Within 2 hours, they had extinguished the fires, patched the flight deck, and restored sufficient boiler power to allow the carrier to resume flight operations. At 13:30 hours, Yamaguchi launched his second and final strike, 10 Nakajima B-5 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway. This would be Tomonaga's final mission. His aircraft had been damaged during the Midway strike, and he knew his fuel tanks would not allow him to return to Hiryu. The Japanese torpedo attack achieved greater success than the earlier dive bombing mission, despite heavy casualties inflicted by American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, causing severe flooding and a 23-degree list that made flight operations impossible. Admiral Fletcher was forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Astoria, apparently confirming Japanese hopes that they had finally sunk an American carrier. Yamaguchi's strikes had demonstrated Japanese naval aviation's continued potency, but they had also expended Hiryu's remaining offensive capability. The carrier had launched her best aircraft and most experienced pilots into desperate attacks, leaving her virtually defenseless against American retaliation. As the afternoon wore on, Yamaguchi prepared for the inevitable American counterattack. Knowing that his ship represented the last operational Japanese carrier in the battle area, the admiral's determination to fight to the end embodied the samurai spirit that had driven Japanese expansion across the Pacific. But it also revealed the strategic bankruptcy of a military culture that valued honor over tactical flexibility. Hiryu's defiant last stand would soon face the concentrated fury of 2 American carrier air groups, setting the stage for the final act of Japan's carrier aviation disaster. At 13:59 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Earl Dickinson led 24 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise toward the last operational Japanese carrier, Hiryu. The afternoon sun glinted off the aircraft's wings as they climbed to attack altitude, carrying with them the hopes of avenging their fallen comrades and completing the destruction of Admiral Nagumo's once mighty fleet. Radio intelligence had pinpointed Hiryu's position, approximately 100 miles northwest of the American task force, and reconnaissance flights had confirmed that the carrier was launching strikes against Yorktown. For Enterprise's air group, this represented an opportunity to settle accounts with the Japanese Navy that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Many of the pilots had friends aboard the Arizona, Oklahoma, and other ships destroyed in that surprise attack. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from Enterprise, had made the calculated decision to launch his remaining aircraft in a coordinated strike against Hiryu rather than holding back reserves for defense. His reasoning was sound, with 3 Japanese carriers already burning. Eliminating the 4th would end any possibility of Japanese victory while removing the immediate threat to his own ships. The strike group that approached Hiryu represented the finest of American naval aviation. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 14 dive bombers from Enterprise's Scouting Squadron 6, while Lieutenant Richard Halsey best commanded 10 aircraft from Bombing Squadron 6. These were the same pilots who had participated in the morning's devastation of Akagi and Kaga, and their confidence was high as they prepared to complete their mission. At 16:55 hours, the American formation spotted Hiryu steaming at high speed with her escort of 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The carrier was frantically attempting to recover the few aircraft returning from the second strike against Yorktown, her flight deck crowded with personnel and equipment. Japanese lookouts spotted the incoming Americans, but Hiryu's depleted combat air patrol could offer little resistance against 24 determined dive bombers. Dickinson rolled into his attack at 17:05 hours, followed in sequence by his squadron mates in a textbook demonstration of dive bombing technique. The dauntless aircraft plunged toward Hiryu at terminal velocity, their pilots fighting the crushing G-forces while keeping their targets centered in their bomb sights. Japanese anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black puffs of smoke, but the Americans pressed home their attack with deadly precision. For direct hits and several near misses transformed Hiryu from a proud fleet carrier into a burning wreck. Within minutes, the first bomb struck near the forward elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among parked aircraft and aviation fuel. Subsequent hits destroyed the island's superstructure and ruptured fuel lines throughout the ship, creating an inferno that quickly spread beyond any hope of control. Admiral Yamaguchi, watching his flagship die around him, made the decision to go down with his ship rather than face the disgrace of survival. Captain Tomio Kaku similarly chose death over surrender, and both officers were last seen standing on Hiryu's bridge as flames consumed the carrier. Their deaths represented the end of an era in Japanese naval aviation, taking with them decades of combat experience and tactical knowledge. The destruction of Hiryu completed one of the most decisive naval victories in history. In a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers, along with their irreplaceable air groups and experienced maintenance crews. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and aviators perished in the battle, including many who had participated in Japan's early victories at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. As evening fell over the Pacific, the burning hulks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu provided stark testimony to the reversal of fortune that had befallen the Japanese fleet. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, was forced to confront the reality that his master plan had resulted in catastrophic defeat. Rather than decisive victory, the American victory at Midway had been achieved through a combination of superior intelligence, tactical flexibility, and the extraordinary courage of aviators who pressed home their attacks despite overwhelming odds. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 and the precision of the dive bomber attacks had demonstrated that American naval aviation had come of age, capable of defeating even the most experienced enemy forces through determination and superior tactics. As dawn broke on June 5, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, 300 miles west of Midway, contemplating the magnitude of his fleet's defeat. The architect of Pearl Harbor, who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for only 6 months to a year before American industrial might turn the tide, now faced the bitter reality of his own prophecy fulfilled ahead of schedule. The overnight reports painted a picture of unmitigated disaster. All 4 fleet carriers of the First Air Fleet were either sunk or sinking, taking with them over 100 aircraft and Japan's most experienced naval aviators. The heavy cruiser Mikuma had been bombed and sunk by American aircraft during the night, while her sister ship Megami limped homeward with severe damage. Most critically, Japan had lost the trained carrier pilots who represented years of intensive preparation and combat experience impossible to replace quickly. At 0 to 55 hours, Yamamoto had issued the painful order to withdraw his forces from the Midway operation. The dream of luring the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle had indeed been realized, but the outcome was precisely opposite to Japanese expectations. Instead of destroying American naval power, the Imperial Navy had suffered its first major defeat since the Battle of the Yellow Sea in 1890. For Captain Watanabe Yasuji, Yamamoto's staff operations officer, later recalled the admiral's reaction to the defeat in his memoirs. The admiral stood silently for several minutes, then simply said, "I have brought dishonor to the emperor." We all knew that the war had fundamentally changed in those 4 days. The American pursuit of the retreating Japanese fleet continued throughout June 5, with strikes launched from Enterprise and Hornet seeking to inflict additional damage on Yamamoto's forces. The heavy cruisers Mikuma and Megami, which had collided during the night withdrawal, became the primary targets for American dive bombers. Mikuma was sent to the bottom by repeated bomb hits, while Mogami barely escaped destruction thanks to her heavy anti-aircraft armament and skillful damage control. Meanwhile, the drama of Yorktown's survival continued in the waters northeast of Midway. The carrier, which Japanese pilots claimed to have sunk twice, remained afloat despite severe damage from Hiryu's attacks. Heroic damage control efforts by her crew had stabilized the ship sufficiently to allow salvage operations, and the destroyer Hammond came alongside to provide power and pumping capacity. However, the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the damaged American carrier since the previous evening. At 13:36 hours on June 6th, Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes at the stationary targets. One torpedo struck Hammond, breaking the destroyer in half and killing 80 sailors instantly. 2 additional torpedoes found Yorktown, sealing the fate of the gallant carrier that had survived both the Coral Sea and Midway battles. The loss of Yorktown provided some consolation to Japanese forces, but it could not obscure the strategic catastrophe that had befallen their navy. The carriers sunk at Midway had represented the core of Japanese naval aviation, accumulated through 2 decades of intensive development. Following the Washington Naval Treaty limitations, their loss left Japan without the means to conduct major offensive operations across the vast Pacific theater. American industrial capacity, which Yamamoto had correctly identified as the ultimate determinant of Pacific War outcomes, now began to demonstrate its overwhelming advantages. The Essex-class carriers already under construction would provide the United States Navy with unprecedented striking power, while Japan's shipbuilding industry could not hope to replace the losses suffered at Midway within any reasonable time frame. The Battle of Midway marked the end of Japanese naval expansion and the beginning of America's inexorable advance across the Pacific. The deadly intent that the title references was not Japanese aggression, but rather the revelation of American determination to fight back with superior intelligence, innovative tactics, and extraordinary courage. The tiny atoll that Yamamoto had chosen as the site for Japan's decisive victory instead became the graveyard of Japanese naval aviation and the turning point of the Pacific War. In the words of Admiral Nimitz's famous communique, Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. Vengeance will not be complete until Japanese sea power is reduced to impotence. The victory at Midway had begun that process, transforming the Pacific from a Japanese lake into contested waters, where American naval power would ultimately prevail. The rising sun flag that had flown triumphantly across the Pacific for 6 months now faced its inevitable sunset, hastened by the deadly intent revealed in the waters around a small coral atoll called Midway.